Two sheriff deputies stood in my driveway while my 11-year-old daughter watched from the living room window asking if we were about to lose our home. 10 minutes later, I opened the eviction paperwork and saw my own father's signature at the bottom. That was the moment I realized the house I had spent 12 years paying for might never have legally belonged to me at all. And the man who taught me to trust family had been quietly building debt, forged documents, and gambling leverage around my name for years. I'm Ethan Carter. I'm 38 years old, a former firefighter from Fort Worth, Texas, and until last year, I believed my father was strict because he wanted his family protected. I believed all the paperwork, all the financial arrangements, all the sacrifices were temporary things families did during hard times. What I didn't understand was that my father had spent over a decade turning my reliability into collateral. While I worked overtime shifts, paid every mortgage bill, repaired every inch of that house with my own hands, and tried raising my daughter after a divorce, he was quietly attaching my name to debts I never approved, trust accounts I barely understood, and financial disasters caused by my younger brother's gambling addiction. They thought I'd stay quiet because I always had before. They thought guilt would keep me obedient the way it always did growing up. But the moment my daughter handed me an envelope filled with birthday money she'd secretly been saving in case we lose the house, something inside me finally broke. I stopped trying to protect my family's reputation. I stopped trying to keep the peace. And for the first time in my life, I started digging through every document my father ever made me sign. The day a sheriff taped an eviction notice to the front door of the house I had spent 12 years paying for was the day I discovered my own father had been quietly stealing from me for over a decade. I didn't know it yet, standing there in my driveway with a toolbox still in my hand and drywall dust on my jeans. But that single piece of paper was about to rip open 14 years of lies, hidden debt, forged signatures, and the kind of family betrayal that changes the way you look at your own last name forever. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 38 years old, a former firefighter from Fort Worth, Texas, and for most of my life, I believed being a good son meant sacrificing first and asking questions later. That belief nearly cost me my home, my savings, and my daughter's future. The sheriff arrived on a Thursday afternoon around 4:30. I remember the time because Sophie was supposed to get home from school at 5, and I was rushing to finish replacing a section of water-damaged flooring in a client's kitchen before traffic got bad. I had just pulled into my driveway when I noticed the county vehicle parked near the curb. At first I thought maybe someone in the neighborhood had complained about parking violations again. Our street had turned strange over the years. Too many retirees watching blinds move like security cameras. Too many people with nothing better to do than track garbage bins and HOA violations. But then the sheriff stepped toward me holding a thick envelope, and I felt something cold move through my stomach before he even opened his mouth. "Ethan Carter?" I nodded slowly. "You've been served." I actually laughed at first, not because it was funny, because my brain genuinely refused to process what he was saying. Served for what? I wasn't being sued. I paid my taxes. I paid my bills. I hadn't even gotten a speeding ticket in years. But then I saw the words across the top page. Notice of eviction. I stared at it long enough for the sheriff to shift awkwardly. "There must be some mistake," I said finally. "I own this house." He didn't argue, didn't sympathize either. He just pointed toward the paperwork and said quietly, "You'll want to contact the property trustee." Trustee. That word hit me harder than eviction somehow, because I knew exactly whose name I was about to see before I even looked down. Richard Carter, my father. I still remember the way the afternoon suddenly felt too bright. Texas heat pressing against my skin while my entire body went numb at the same time. The paperwork said the property had entered a transfer dispute under the Carter Family Residential Trust. According to the filing, I had failed to meet financial obligations connected to the trust agreement, and occupancy rights were being revoked pending formal review. Occupancy rights, not ownership. Occupancy, like I was some tenant living in another man's house. I must have read the same paragraph 6 times before I noticed my father's signature at the bottom. That was the moment something inside me shifted, because confusion only lasts so long before memory starts connecting dots you spent years trying not to see. My father had always loved paperwork. Contracts, handshakes, temporary arrangements. He built his whole life around making people feel like they owed him something, especially family, especially me. The sheriff left after a few minutes. He probably thought he was leaving behind another angry homeowner dealing with some inheritance dispute. He had no idea he'd just delivered the first crack in a lie my family had been building around me for years. I walked into the house slowly after he drove away. Same hallway, same hardwood floors I installed myself. Same faded pencil marks on the kitchen wall where Sophie and I tracked her height every birthday. Same living room where Claire and I used to sit after midnight eating takeout on the floor before we could afford furniture. Every inch of that house carried pieces of my life. I had rebuilt half of it with my own hands after a pipe burst in 2017. I replaced the roof after a hailstorm. I paid every mortgage bill, every utility, every repair. Yet somehow, according to the documents in my hand, the house legally belonged to a trust controlled by my father. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the papers until I heard Sophie come through the front door. "Dad!" I folded the documents immediately. She stepped into the kitchen wearing her oversized school hoodie and carrying a science project that looked like it was one bad turn away from collapsing. Sophie was 11 then, quiet like her mother, observant in ways kids shouldn't have to be. She looked at my face for maybe 2 seconds before setting the project down carefully. What happened? That was the thing about Sophie. You couldn't lie well around her. She noticed tone changes, eye movements, silences. She'd grown up watching adults disappoint each other and learned early how to read the emotional weather in a room. "Nothing," I said automatically. She kept staring. Then softer. "Did Grandpa call again?" I looked away after that because the truth was, whenever something bad happened in my life lately, there was a decent chance my father's name was attached to it somewhere. "No," I said. "Not exactly." She nodded slowly like she already understood more than I wanted her to. My relationship with my parents had been complicated long before the eviction notice showed up. Complicated is the polite word anyway. The honest word would probably be transactional. Growing up, my father taught me that love was something you earned through usefulness. If you worked hard, stayed loyal, and solved problems without complaining, you mattered. If you struggled, needed help, or pushed back, you became a burden. My younger brother Mason figured that out early and adapted by becoming charming instead of responsible. He learned how to talk his way out of consequences while I learned how to absorb them. Mason was 34 now and somehow still drifting through life like responsibility was a temporary condition other people chose for themselves. Gambling problems, failed business ideas, bar fights, girlfriends constantly rotating through his life like weather systems. Every time he crashed financially, my father stepped in to protect him. Every time my father stepped in, somehow I ended up paying for it indirectly. I didn't realize how deep that pattern went until much later. After Claire and I divorced 5 years earlier, things got worse. Not openly at first. My father pretended concern while quietly treating my separation like evidence I'd failed at life. He'd say things like, "A man who can't hold his family together loses authority," while asking to borrow money 2 days later. My mother never contradicted him. She just sat there during Sunday dinners nodding faintly like silence counted as neutrality. Claire used to warn me about them constantly. "They don't see you as a son," she told me once during our marriage. "They see you as infrastructure." I got angry when she said that, defended them, said she didn't understand family loyalty. Looking back now, I think part of me already knew she was right. I just wasn't ready to admit it. The first person I called after Sophie went upstairs was my father. He answered on the second ring. "Well," he said casually, "guess you finally got the paperwork." Not confusion, not concern. Not even pretending, just calm satisfaction. "What the hell is this?" I asked. He sighed like I was exhausting him already. "It's a trust dispute, Ethan. Relax. You put an eviction notice on my house. Our house." he corrected immediately. Technically. I stood up so fast my chair scraped backward across the tile. What are you talking about technically? I bought this house. No, he said calmly. You paid into it. Different thing. That sentence stayed with me because it was delivered so casually. Like he'd been waiting years to say it out loud. My father started explaining everything in the same slow tone he used when I was a kid getting lectured about responsibility. According to him, after my mother's health scare 14 years earlier, they'd created a family trust to protect assets. At the time, I'd been 24, exhausted from firefighting shifts, newly married, and too distracted trying to survive adulthood to pay attention when my father pushed papers in front of me at family dinners saying things like, just standard legal stuff. Apparently one of those documents tied the house purchase into the trust structure because my credit score back then was stronger than theirs. You said it was temporary. I told him. It was, he replied. Until it wasn't. I could hear television noise in the background. My mother probably sitting there pretending not to listen. I've paid every mortgage bill for 12 years. And we appreciated that. The rage that hit me then felt almost dizzying. You appreciated it? Watch your tone. No, you watch yours. I snapped. You let me spend 12 years believing I owned that house. You lived there, didn't you? I actually stopped breathing for a second after that because suddenly every memory started rearranging itself. Every strange conversation. Every time my father insisted on reviewing paperwork. Every weird delay whenever I mentioned refinancing. Every excuse about trust logistics. Things I ignored because ignoring them was easier than confronting what they implied. You forged this, I said quietly. No, he replied. You signed it. That scared me more than yelling would have. Because the truth was, I genuinely couldn't remember. Years of documents, insurance forms, loan papers, tax adjustments. My father always handled things during chaotic moments when people were distracted or overwhelmed. He'd slide folders across tables saying, just sign here. And because he was my father, because I trusted him, because I was conditioned to trust him, I usually did. I want copies of everything, I said. You'll get them through the trustee attorney. Then his tone shifted slightly. You should also know Mason may need to stay there temporarily. I felt my stomach drop. What? He's had some financial setbacks. Of course he had. You're moving Mason into my house? It's not just your house. There it was. The real reason underneath all of it. Not money, control. My father didn't care about the property itself nearly as much as he cared about reminding me that nothing in my life truly belonged to me without his approval. No, I said flatly. You don't actually have the authority to make that decision right now. You think I'm letting Mason live near my daughter? He's your brother. He's unstable. He's family. That word again. Family. In my family, that word functioned less like love and more like debt collection. The call ended badly after that. My father accusing me of selfishness. Me threatening legal action. My mother finally grabbing the phone just long enough to say, "You're overreacting again," before hanging up completely. Again. Like this was somehow another one of my unreasonable emotional episodes instead of a man discovering his father may have stolen his home. That night I barely slept. I sat in the dark living room after Sophie went to bed rereading every page from the eviction packet while memories kept surfacing in fragments. I remembered my father insisting on attending the closing appointment when I bought the house. I remembered him taking documents to make copies afterward. I remembered noticing once years earlier that some mortgage statements were addressed to the trust instead of me. But when I asked, he dismissed it as tax structuring. I wanted to believe there had to be some misunderstanding, some technical explanation. But deep down, another part of me already knew something much uglier was sitting underneath all this. The next morning, I called the mortgage company directly. That conversation changed everything. The woman on the phone sounded confused almost immediately. "Sir," she said carefully, "according to our records, the primary account holder connected to the property is the Carter Family Residential Trust. But the payments come from my account." "Yes," she said slowly. Authorized transfer account ending in 4472. My checking account. I gripped the counter harder. I want full payment records. She hesitated. You'll need authorization from the trust administrator. Which is? Pause. Richard Carter. I closed my eyes after that because suddenly I understood the scale of what had happened. My father hadn't stolen one thing. He had built an entire system around me. A legal structure designed so I carried the financial burden while he retained actual control. And if that was true, then I had no idea what else carried my name without my knowledge. I spent the rest of the day digging through old storage boxes in the garage while Sophie stayed unusually quiet upstairs. Around 3 in the afternoon, Claire showed up unexpectedly to drop off some school forms Sophie forgot at her apartment. The second she saw my face, she frowned. What happened? I told her. Not everything, just enough. She listened without interrupting while I explained the trust. The eviction notice, Mason possibly moving in. Then she leaned back slowly against the kitchen counter and muttered something under her breath. What? She looked at me carefully. Ethan, do you remember that huge fight we had after buying this house? I frowned. Which one? The one where your dad took all the closing paperwork home. Pieces started clicking together immediately. Claire crossed her arms. I told you back then it felt wrong. Your father wouldn't even let me review half the documents. I remembered now. Barely. We'd argued for hours because she thought my father was too involved in our finances. I defended him so aggressively that she ended up crying in the bathroom while I accused her of disrespecting my family. I thought she was overreacting. I said quietly. Claire gave a sad little laugh. You always did. That hurt because it was true. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. Ethan, there's something else. She walked toward her purse slowly and pulled out an old folded document. I found this years ago and almost showed you during the divorce. I unfolded it carefully. It was a bank transfer authorization form. My signature sat at the bottom. Except it wasn't my signature. Not really. Close enough to pass quickly. Wrong enough once you looked harder. Transfer authorization connected to a secondary residential debt account under the Carter Trust. My father's handwriting covered parts of the margins. What is this? I whispered. Claire looked exhausted suddenly. I think your father's been moving money through your name for years. The room went completely silent after that. Outside, I could hear kids playing basketball somewhere down the street. A dog barking. Normal life continuing like my entire reality hadn't just started collapsing inward piece by piece. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Mason. Heard things got messy. Dad says I'll probably need your spare room for a while. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I stared at that message for a very long time. Because right then, for the first time in my life, I stopped seeing my family as chaotic or difficult or flawed. I started seeing them as dangerous. And deep down, I already knew this was only the beginning. The first thing my lawyer said after reviewing the trust documents was, "Your father didn't build this casually." That sentence stayed with me because up until then, some part of me still wanted to believe this was just manipulation layered on top of bad family boundaries. Ugly, sure. Toxic, definitely. But fixable. Misunderstood. Temporary. Instead, the man sitting across from me in that downtown office was looking at the paperwork with the same expression people reserve for structural damage hiding behind walls. Calm on the surface, serious underneath. His name was Victor Hale, late 50s, silver hair, former military, the kind of attorney who spoke slowly because he expected people to listen the first time. Claire recommended him after hearing what happened, and by the end of our first meeting, I understood why. He didn't react emotionally to any of it. He just kept organizing the documents into neat piles while quietly dismantling my entire understanding of my financial life. You signed most of these, he said. I don't remember half of them. That's common in family trust abuse cases. The word abuse landed strangely in my chest. I wasn't ready for it yet. Abuse sounded too dramatic, too intentional. My father yelled sometimes, manipulated constantly, controlled everything quietly, but I still carried the stupid instinct to soften the language around him. Victor didn't. Ethan, he said carefully, your father structured this so that you carried financial liability while he maintained administrative authority. That doesn't happen accidentally. I looked down at the paperwork spread across the table. Mortgage records, equity transfers, trust amendments, loan authorizations. The deeper we dug, the stranger it became. The house technically belonged to the Carter Family Residential Trust, but almost every payment attached to maintaining that property came directly from me. Utilities, repairs, taxes, insurance, renovation costs, even landscaping fees in some years. My father had built a legal arrangement where I functioned like the financial backbone of an asset I didn't fully own. Can he actually evict me? I asked finally. Victor leaned back slightly. Not quickly, not legally without challenge, but he's counting on intimidation, confusion, and family pressure before this ever reaches court. Family pressure. He turned out to be right about that faster than either of us expected. By that evening, my phone had already become a war zone. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly checking in. An aunt leaving a voicemail about forgiveness. My mother texting me paragraphs about how family misunderstandings shouldn't become public embarrassment. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody asked whether the documents were fraudulent. Every conversation carried the same underlying message. Stop making problems. That was the role I'd always played in my family. Contain the damage. Absorb the tension. Keep things functional even when they weren't fair. Around 7 that night, Mason showed up unannounced. I saw his truck pull into the driveway while Sophie was upstairs doing homework. He climbed out wearing sunglasses even though the sun had already started setting. Expensive boots he probably couldn't afford. And the same relaxed grin he used whenever he needed something from somebody. I stepped outside before he reached the porch. You're not coming in. He lifted both hands casually. Jesus, Ethan, relax. Dad said you're spiraling again. Again. That word kept appearing. Like standing between my daughter and homelessness somehow qualified as another emotional overreaction. You knew about this? Mason shrugged. About the trust? Yeah. My chest tightened immediately. How long? A while. How long? Mason. He looked away briefly. Couple years, maybe. I stared at him in disbelief. You knew Dad was claiming ownership of my house and said nothing? It's not exactly stealing if you signed the papers. There it was again. That sentence. Like my signature somehow erased manipulation, deception, pressure, conditioning, all of it. You're unbelievable. No, he said, suddenly sharper. You're just finally realizing Dad built everything around you because you were the reliable one. That's not my fault. I laughed once after that. Not because anything was funny. Because hearing your younger brother describe your exploitation like a compliment does something strange to your nervous system. What do you want? He hesitated then, which told me immediately this visit had an actual purpose underneath the performance. I need somewhere to stay for a little while. I almost smiled at the predictability of it. No. Come on, Ethan. No. You've got 3 bedrooms. You gambled away your apartment again? His jaw tightened. It's temporary. That's what you said last time. 3 years earlier, I'd let Mason stay with me for 6 weeks after one of his sports betting disasters exploded. 6 weeks turned into 4 months. Missing cash. Strange people showing up late at night. Sophie crying once because Mason screamed at somebody on speakerphone loud enough to shake the walls. When I finally forced him out, my father accused me of abandoning family. Mason stepped closer then, lowering his voice. You really want to do this right now? Dad's serious this time. I felt something shift inside me hearing that because suddenly the eviction notice stopped feeling like leverage and started feeling coordinated. You knew this was coming before the sheriff showed up, didn't you? Silence. That told me enough. My brother looked toward the house briefly before speaking again. Dad's trying to protect what's left. What does that mean? Another pause. Then carefully. There's debt. Ethan. The air seemed to leave the street around us. What kind of debt? Mason rubbed the back of his neck. Business stuff. You don't have a business. Dad does. My stomach dropped instantly because my father hadn't owned an active company in almost 8 years. How bad? Mason looked genuinely nervous now. Worse than he expected. That was the first moment I realized the house might not even be the actual target. It might just be collateral damage from something much larger collapsing behind the scenes. You need to leave, I said quietly. Ethan, now. For a second, I thought he might argue harder. But something in my face must have changed because he backed away slowly after that. As he opened his truck door, he said one last thing. You think Dad's the problem, but you don't understand how much of this family depends on him. I didn't answer because deep down I was beginning to suspect the opposite might actually be true. That night Sophie came downstairs around midnight while I sat at the kitchen table buried in paperwork again. She stood silently in the hallway for a few seconds before walking over with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Are we losing the house? Kids always hear more than adults think they do. I pulled out the chair beside me slowly. Why would you ask that? I heard Uncle Mason outside. Of course she did. I looked at her for a long moment, trying to decide how much truth an 11-year-old deserved. Then I remembered how much lying and pretending had shaped my own childhood and decided I wasn't doing that to her. I don't know yet, I admitted. She nodded once. No panic, no tears, just quiet processing. Then she asked the question that nearly broke me. Did Grandpa lie to you? I couldn't answer immediately because hearing it phrased that simply stripped away all the excuses adults use to protect themselves from reality. Yes, I said finally. Sophie looked down at the table. Mom says people who love you aren't supposed to make you feel confused all the time. I stared at her after that because it sounded exactly like something Claire would say. And because children somehow manage to summarize entire lifetimes of emotional damage in one sentence without even trying. The next morning, Victor called me earlier than expected. We found something. His tone alone made my pulse spike. I drove downtown immediately while Sophie stayed with Claire for the day. Victor already had files spread across his conference table when I arrived. There are secondary debt accounts attached to the trust, he said. How many? 6. I sat down slowly. The total balance across all 6 accounts was just under $480,000. I genuinely thought there had to be a mistake. What the hell is this? Victor pointed toward several records. Lines of credit, business loans, property leverage accounts. None of these are mine. Legally, some of them partially are. My vision blurred for a second reading through the names attached to the accounts. My father, the trust, and in multiple places, me. But I never approved this. That may help later, Victor said carefully. But right now the immediate issue is exposure. I rubbed both hands over my face hard enough to hurt. How could he even qualify for this much debt? Victor didn't answer right away. Then quietly, because your income stabilized the trust. I looked up slowly. That was the moment I realized the full scale of what my father had built around me. He didn't just use me emotionally. He used me structurally. My credit history, my employment records, my reliability, my financial discipline. Everything I spent my adult life building became support beams inside a financial system I barely understood. And if that system collapsed, it would collapse onto me first. Victor slid another document across the table. This account concerns me most. I looked down. Commercial gambling markers, attached to Mason, guaranteed through the trust. I felt physically sick. You're telling me my father tied my house to Mason's gambling debt? Victor's silence answered for him. I stood up abruptly and walked toward the office window because suddenly I couldn't breathe properly sitting down anymore. Outside, downtown traffic moved normally. People carrying coffee, construction crews working nearby. Ordinary life continuing while my entire financial reality disintegrated piece by piece. Then Victor spoke again. There's another issue. I turned back slowly. He handed me photocopies from older trust amendments. These signatures don't match consistently. I stared at the pages. Some looked close enough to mine. Others looked rushed, distorted, almost practiced. You think he forged them? I think somebody did. Somebody, not necessarily my father. My mind immediately went to Mason. I left the office in a fog after that. Halfway home, Claire called asking if Sophie could stay another night because she sensed things were escalating. I almost said no out of instinct. Pride maybe, guilt. Then I realized my daughter probably deserved at least one quiet evening away from this disaster. Yeah, I said finally. That's probably better. Claire hesitated before speaking again. Ethan, there's something else I never told you. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. Back when we were married, your father asked me once if I'd ever signed financial authorization forms for you if you were too busy. A cold sensation moved through my chest. What did you say? I told him absolutely not. When was this? About a year before Sophie was born. I closed my eyes briefly at a red light because suddenly another realization started forming beneath all the others. This wasn't impulsive. My father had been preparing systems around me for years, carefully, patiently, like a contractor reinforcing weak points inside a structure before anybody notices what he's building. That evening, I finally did something I should have done years earlier. I went through every storage box, every filing cabinet, every old folder in the garage and attic, tax returns, insurance papers, loan records. Half my adult life existed inside those boxes. Around midnight, I found the first undeniable proof, a refinancing packet from 11 years earlier. My signature appeared on page 7, except on page 9. Changed slightly. Page 11 changed again. 3 versions of my signature inside one document set. Tiny differences most people would never notice. But I noticed because firefighters spend years learning how to recognize patterns under stress. Small inconsistencies save lives sometimes. I spread more documents across the floor. More signature variations. More inconsistencies. My hands started shaking slightly then. Not from fear exactly, but from the horrifying realization that I genuinely didn't know how much of my life had been manipulated. Then I found something worse. A trust amendment listing contingent occupancy transition terms. Mason's name appeared beneath mine. Successor residential beneficiary. I reread the paragraph 3 times before understanding what it meant. If something happened to me financially, legally, or physically, Mason gained occupancy access to the property. My house, my daughter's home. I sat there on the floor until almost 2 in the morning staring at that page while memories kept resurfacing differently now. Every time my father insisted I work overtime instead of spending holidays away. Every conversation about responsibility. Every subtle comparison between me and Mason. My father never expected Mason to become stable. He expected me to remain functional enough to subsidize instability forever. I finally understood the family dynamic completely then. Mason was the appetite. I was the fuel source. The next morning, my father called for the first time since the eviction notice. I almost ignored it. Almost. Hello. You need to stop involving lawyers. No greeting. No concern. Straight to control. You forged my signatures. You signed willingly. You tied my house to Mason's gambling debts. Silence. Then colder. Watch what you accuse people of. I laughed quietly after that because hearing him threaten me while I held actual evidence suddenly made him sound smaller somehow. You should have just talked to me, he continued. Now outsiders are involved. Outsiders. That word told me everything. In families like mine, secrecy functions like oxygen. Problems stay manageable as long as nobody external sees them clearly. You stole from me. We sacrificed for you your entire life. There it is, I said softly. What? The part where you confuse control with sacrifice. I heard my mother say something faintly in the background. Then my father lowered his voice. You think you're protecting Sophie right now, but all you're doing is destroying this family. That sentence hit harder than I expected because guilt conditioning doesn't disappear overnight. Even when people hurt you repeatedly, part of you still fears becoming the villain in their version of events. Then he added quietly, "You always overreact when you feel abandoned." And just like that, I was 12 years old again emotionally, standing in a garage while my father criticized me for crying after a football injury, hearing him explain weakness like it was a character flaw, feeling ashamed for needing comfort. Except this time something different happened. Instead of shrinking, I got angry, real anger, not defensive frustration, not emotional panic. Clarity. "You know what's interesting?" I said calmly. "You still think this conversation is about emotions." He went quiet. "This isn't about abandonment anymore." I continued. "It's about fraud." Then I hung up. My entire body shook
Mom,
afterward,
it's literally.
but not from fear, from adrenaline, because for the first time in my life, I'd ended a conversation with my father without trying to repair his feelings afterward. About 20 minutes later, Sophie called me from Claire's apartment. "Dad." "Yeah." Her voice sounded small suddenly. "I found something in my backpack." "What is it?" She hesitated. Then softly, "An envelope." My stomach tightened immediately. "What kind of envelope?" "It says for college." I gripped the phone harder. Inside the envelope was every dollar Sophie had saved over 3 birthdays, 2 Christmases, and countless small chores. Just over $400 total. Notes folded carefully beside the money in uneven handwriting. "In case we need it for the house." I had to pull my truck over after hearing that because suddenly I couldn't see the road clearly anymore. That was the moment everything stopped being abstract. Not the eviction notice, not the debt, not the forged signatures. That envelope. Because my 11-year-old daughter believed we might lose our home and decided to try helping me with birthday money she'd been saving for years. And sitting there on the side of that road with tears burning behind my eyes, I realized something that terrified me more than the fraud itself. If I didn't stop this now, Sophie would grow up learning the exact same lessons I did. That love means sacrifice without limits. That family means guilt. That being dependable means allowing yourself to be used. No, absolutely not. That was the moment I stopped trying to preserve my family and started preparing to expose it. The fraud investigation officially started on a Monday morning. And by Friday afternoon, my father's entire life had begun collapsing in ways he never saw coming. What shocked me most wasn't the speed of it. It was how fragile everything actually was underneath the image he'd spent decades building. Men like my father survive by controlling perception. As long as people believe they're stable, respectable, capable, nobody looks too closely at the structure underneath. But the moment paperwork starts moving between banks, attorneys, and investigators, perception stops matching. Facts take over. And facts don't care about family loyalty. Victor filed the first formal dispute 3 days after I handed him the forged documents. He moved carefully at first, focusing on signature inconsistencies and unauthorized financial exposure tied to the trust accounts. The goal initially wasn't revenge. It was containment, protect my credit, stop the eviction, freeze additional trust actions before more damage spread. But once the financial institutions started reviewing transaction histories, bigger problems surfaced almost immediately. The first bank flagged 12 suspicious transfers connected to a dormant construction account under my father's old company name. The second bank found irregular refinancing activity tied to overlapping debt obligations. Then the gambling markers attached to Mason triggered additional compliance reviews because several transactions crossed state lines through online betting networks already under federal scrutiny. By Wednesday morning, 2 separate institutions had temporarily restricted outgoing trust transfers pending verification. That was when my father finally panicked. Not emotionally, strategically. He showed up at my house around 8 that night wearing the same expression he used during emergencies when I was a kid. Calm face, controlled voice, eyes moving too fast underneath. I opened the front door but didn't invite him inside. For a second, we just stared at each other in silence. He looked older than I remembered, not weaker exactly, just worn around the edges in a way I'd never noticed before because growing up, my father always seemed immovable to me, solid, permanent, the kind of man who entered rooms already expecting obedience. You filed fraud claims against your own family, he said quietly. I crossed my arms. You committed fraud against your own son. His jaw flexed slightly. You have no idea what you've started. No, I replied. I think for the first time I finally do. He glanced past me into the house automatically like he still expected unrestricted access to my life. That tiny movement irritated me more than yelling would have. Where's Sophie? With Claire. That's probably for the best while you calm down. I laughed once under my breath. You still think this is temporary. This is emotional. No, I said. This is documented. Something cold passed through his expression then. Not guilt, not regret, calculation. You're going to destroy this family over paperwork? The insane part was that he genuinely believed that sentence made sense. Like forged signatures and hidden debt were unfortunate misunderstandings, while accountability itself was the betrayal. You used my name for years. I protected you for years. There it is again, I muttered. What? That thing you do where exploitation becomes sacrifice if you phrase it confidently enough. He stepped closer after that. You think you're morally clean here? You think your little lawyer understands what this family survived? What I carried? I stared at him carefully because suddenly I realized something important. My father wasn't defending his actions anymore. He was defending his identity. Men like him can survive financial problems. What they cannot survive psychologically is losing authority. You could have just talked to me, he continued. We could have handled this privately. You mean quietly? His face hardened instantly. You don't understand what happens if these accounts fully unravel. Then explain it. Silence. That told me everything. My father looked away briefly toward the street before lowering his voice further. Mason owes people money. I know. No, he snapped suddenly. You don't. That was the first genuine crack I'd seen in him since this started. He got involved with the wrong people. What people? Another silence. Then carefully. Sports syndicates. Private lenders. I felt my stomach tighten. How much? He lost control. How much? Dad. Over 200,000. The number hit me like a physical impact because suddenly everything made horrifying sense. The trust leverage, the refinancing, the desperation around the house. Mason wasn't just irresponsible anymore. He was drowning. And you used my house to cover him. I used family assets to protect family. No, I said slowly. You sacrificed me to save him. His face changed after that. Tiny shift, barely visible. But for the first time in my life, I think my father realized I wasn't coming back under control. You were always stronger, he said quietly. That sentence should have sounded like praise. Instead, it sounded like justification. You think because I survive things better, I deserve them more. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. We stood there in silence for several seconds before he spoke again. If the banks pull everything apart, Mason's finished. I looked at him carefully then and finally understood the central truth of my family. My father didn't love fairly. He loved according to vulnerability. Mason received protection because Mason collapsed easily. I received responsibility because I endured quietly. I'm not saving him anymore, I said. You'd let your own brother lose everything? I almost answered immediately. Then I realized something. He wasn't asking about Mason. He was asking about himself. You already let me lose everything, I replied. Then I closed the door. That night, I barely slept again. Not from fear this time, from memory. Once you stop protecting people emotionally, your brain starts replaying your entire life differently. Moments I once interpreted as responsibility now looked like grooming. Every crisis somehow redirecting toward me. Every family emergency ending with my finances involved. Every guilt trip carefully targeted around loyalty and obligation. At 2 in the morning, Claire texted asking if I was awake. A minute later, she called. I need to tell you something before somebody else does. Her voice sounded tense immediately. What happened? I got a message from your mother. Of course she did. What did she say? Claire hesitated briefly. She blamed me. I leaned back against the couch cushions slowly. For what? For turning you against them. She said this all started when you married me. I closed my eyes because hearing that felt painfully familiar. My parents always needed external villains whenever control slipped. Spouses, friends, therapists, lawyers, anyone except themselves. She also said something else. Claire continued carefully. Something weird. What? She said your father spent years trying to keep you from becoming soft like your grandfather. That sentence pulled something loose in my memory immediately. My grandfather. Nobody talked about him much growing up. My father's father supposedly disappeared decades earlier after abandoning the family. That was the official version anyway. Every story about him carried shame attached to it. Weakness, failure, cowardice. Claire, I said slowly, did my dad ever talk about him around you? Only once. She paused. He said men who leave family behind deserve to die alone. I didn't answer immediately after that because suddenly I wondered how much of my father's identity was built around fear of becoming his own father. The next morning, the second wave hit. Community gossip. Small towns and suburban neighborhoods operate like nervous systems. Information travels through them invisibly before eventually reaching everyone. By breakfast, people had started hearing versions of the story. By lunch, those versions mutated. By evening, I was getting messages from church members asking if the rumors about legal trouble were true. Not my father. Me. That was another thing men like him understand instinctively. If blame becomes unavoidable, redirect it early. One contractor I'd known for years called me privately around noon. You okay? Depends who's asking. He sighed heavily. Your dad's telling people you're unstable. I laughed quietly. Of course he is. He's saying the divorce messed you up. There it was. Another classic move. Emotional discrediting. If people question your stability first, they stop questioning your evidence second. The contractor lowered his voice slightly. Look, Ethan, off the record. Your father's owed money around town longer than you probably know. I sat up straighter immediately. What kind of money? Supplier debt, personal loans, deferred payments. He hesitated. Some guys stopped working with him years ago. Why? Silence. Then carefully. People got tired of paperwork changing. My pulse spiked instantly. What does that mean? Means numbers moved around too much. After the call ended, I immediately forwarded the information to Victor. Less than an hour later, he called back sounding more serious than before. This may go beyond family fraud. How bad? If your father altered commercial financial documents repeatedly, investigators may widen the review substantially. I stared out the kitchen window while he explained potential exposure ranges. Civil fraud, financial misrepresentation, identity misuse, trust abuse. My father spent decades constructing an image of himself as the smartest man in every room. Now that same confidence might destroy him. Around for that afternoon, Mason disappeared. Literally. Nobody could reach him. His phone disconnected. Apartment emptied. Truck abandoned behind a closed sports bar 20 miles outside town. My mother called me crying hard enough I could barely understand her. Do you know where he is? No. You've destroyed this family. I almost hung up right there. Then something stopped me. When did you know? I asked quietly. Silence. Mom. When did you know about the debt? More silence. Then finally, exhausted, your father said it was temporary. That answer hurt more than denial somehow because it confirmed what I'd slowly begun realizing. My mother wasn't innocent, passive maybe, frightened possibly, but not unaware. You watched him use me. We were trying to survive. No, I said softly. You were trying to maintain appearances. She started crying harder after that. I protected you your whole life. I looked around the kitchen slowly while hearing those words because survivors of manipulative families eventually understand something devastating. Protection without honesty becomes another form of control. You protected Dad, I replied. Then I ended the call. That evening Sophie came home from Claire's place carrying her backpack and a strange quietness around her shoulders. What's wrong? I asked. She hesitated near the hallway. Someone said something at school. Cold anger moved through me instantly. What? A girl said Grandpa told her parents you're stealing from the family. I actually felt dizzy for a second because suddenly my father dragging this into public circles involved my daughter directly. What did you say? Sophie shrugged faintly. Nothing. Then softer. I didn't know if maybe it was true. That sentence nearly shattered me. Not because she doubted me, because she was scared enough to wonder. I sat beside her carefully on the couch. Sophie, listen to me. My voice cracked slightly. I have never stolen from this family. She nodded quickly. I know. But the hesitation before she said it told me the damage had already started spreading. That night after she went upstairs, I sat alone in the dark for hours replaying everything again. My father wasn't just fighting financially anymore. He was trying to reclaim narrative control before evidence fully surfaced. That realization made me angrier than anything else so far. Then around 11:30, Victor called unexpectedly. We found another document. Something in his tone immediately put me on edge. What kind of document? A life insurance amendment. I frowned. What? It was attached to the trust archive. I drove downtown again despite the late hour because at that point sleep barely existed anymore anyway. Victor already had the file open when I arrived. Your father attempted to list the trust as partial beneficiary on your former firefighter policy 6 years ago. I stared at him blankly. That's impossible. It failed eventually due to processing conflicts, he explained carefully. But the attempt existed. I looked down at the paperwork slowly. My signature appeared near the bottom again. Forged. A horrible realization started forming underneath everything else. How many things did he put my name on? Victor didn't answer immediately. Then quietly, we don't know yet. That was the most terrifying sentence anyone had spoken to me since this began. We don't know yet, because suddenly the fraud stopped feeling contained. It stopped feeling like one house or one trust or one financial disaster. It started feeling systemic, like my father had been quietly constructing entire layers of financial architecture around my identity for years. Then Victor handed me another envelope. This came through certified delivery earlier today. No return address. Inside sat a handwritten letter folded carefully into thirds. The handwriting looked familiar immediately. My mother's. Ethan, if you're reading this, your father doesn't know I sent it. There are things you were never supposed to find. Your father always believed pressure made people stronger. He learned that from his own father. But somewhere along the way, surviving became more important to him than loving people honestly. I should have stopped this years ago. I didn't. That's my fault too. My hands tightened around the page. There was more. If anything happens publicly, there's a box in the storage unit on Denton Highway under your father's old business records. Look for file 28C. Your father never knew I kept copies. Copies. I looked up at Victor immediately. What storage unit? He was already writing down the address. An hour later, we stood inside a dimly lit storage facility, surrounded by rows of metal doors, while rain hammered the roof overhead hard enough to sound like static. Victor insisted we document everything carefully before touching anything. Part of me still couldn't believe this was my life now. Secret evidence boxes, fraud investigations, my mother sneaking letters behind my father's back like we were inside some collapsing crime family instead of suburban Texas. Unit 42 opened with a grinding metallic sound. Dust hit first, then old cardboard. Shelves lined the walls filled with records stretching back years. Construction invoices, tax binders, equipment receipts. Entire sections labeled under my father's old company. Victor found file 28C near the back. Inside sat photocopies, bank transfers, unauthorized account movements, signature overlays, and one document that made my entire body go cold. A notarized power authorization draft naming my father temporary executor over my assets in the event of mental instability. My forged signature sat at the bottom, dated 2 months after my divorce. I stared at it while nausea rolled through my stomach. He was preparing contingencies, not just financially, personally, legally, like somewhere deep down. My father always expected the day might come when he needed full control over my life. Victor carefully photographed everything while I stood there trying to process the scale of what I was seeing. Then he found the final page. A handwritten note clipped to the back. Richard, Ethan can't know how exposed the trust really is. If he pulls away financially before Mason stabilizes, everything collapses. My mother's handwriting, dated 4 years earlier. I closed my eyes after reading that because suddenly every remaining illusion finally died completely. Not one betrayal, not one desperate mistake. A system, maintained together, for years. And standing inside that storage unit while rain pounded overhead and old fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above us, I realized something that frightened me almost as much as the fraud itself. My parents never actually expected me to stop obeying them. That was their fatal mistake. Because once someone raised to survive finally stops protecting the people hurting them, the truth comes out fast. The final collapse of my family didn't happen with screaming or police sirens or dramatic courtroom speeches like people imagine when they hear stories about fraud and betrayal. It happened slowly, then all at once, like a building rotting internally for years before one support beam finally gives way and suddenly the entire structure can't hold itself upright anymore. By the time winter arrived, my father had stopped pretending the investigation was a misunderstanding. The banks weren't cooperating with him anymore. Neither were the attorneys. Too many records existed now. Too many signatures failed verification under review. Too many hidden accounts connected back to the trust. Once financial investigators start mapping patterns instead of isolated incidents, the truth spreads outward fast. Every transaction becomes connected to another one. Every lie creates paperwork, and paperwork doesn't forget. The first official blow came from the District Fraud Division. Victor called me early one morning while I was making Sophie breakfast before school. His voice sounded calm, but underneath it I could hear something else. Finality. They're escalating. I leaned against the kitchen counter slowly. Criminal. Potentially. Sophie looked up from the table immediately because children always notice tone changes even when they don't understand the words. I forced a small smile toward her. Eat your eggs. She nodded quietly but kept watching me. Victor continued. The trust review uncovered unauthorized leverage activity tied to forged authorization sequences. They're now reviewing whether your father knowingly misrepresented asset ownership during multiple refinancing cycles. I closed my eyes briefly because hearing it phrased that clinically somehow made everything feel even uglier. What happens now? There'll likely be formal interviews first. Financial seizure possibilities after that. Seizure. Another word that didn't sound real attached to my father until suddenly it did. After I dropped Sophie at school, I drove around aimlessly for nearly an hour instead of going home. I kept thinking about the version of my father that existed in my childhood memories. The man teaching me how to repair engines in the garage. The man showing up to football games still wearing work boots covered in concrete dust. The man who used to tell me that loyalty mattered more than comfort because at the end of life, family was all you had left. The hardest part about family betrayal isn't hatred. It's grief, because the people hurting you often exist beside the people you once loved. And your brain keeps trying to separate them into different individuals even when they're the same person. By noon, the town had fully turned against my father. Not publicly at first. Quietly, subtly. Contractors stopped returning calls. Church members suddenly became unavailable. Invitations disappeared. People who once praised him as dependable began using words like complicated and concerning. That's how communities handle scandal before certainty arrives. Nobody jumps immediately. They create distance first. Then the local paper published a small article about ongoing financial irregularities connected to a former residential contracting business. No names, but everybody knew. Mason finally resurfaced 2 days later. I got the call at nearly midnight from a county detention officer asking if I was willing to confirm family identity for processing records. Apparently Mason had been picked up outside a casino 40 miles away after getting into a fight with a sportsbook lender over unpaid debt. I sat there in silence listening while the officer explained the situation mechanically. He listed you as emergency contact. Of course he did. I almost refused automatically. Then something stopped me. Not guilt exactly. Exhaustion maybe. Is he hurt? Minor injuries. I drove there mostly because I wanted answers. Mason looked terrible when they brought him out. Split lip, bruises under both eyes, hoodie stained with dried blood and cigarette ash. For the first time in his life, he didn't look charming or reckless or carefree. He looked scared. He sat across from me in the visitation room, rubbing his hands together constantly. You shouldn't have come. You listed my name. Silence. Then finally, Dad told me not to talk to you. I laughed quietly. I'm shocked. Mason looked down at the table. You don't understand how bad things got. Then explain it. For several seconds, I genuinely thought he wouldn't. Then something inside him finally cracked. It started after Mom got sick years ago, he muttered. Dad borrowed against everything trying to keep up appearances. I frowned. What appearances? The business, the house, church stuff, all of it. He swallowed hard. He said people stop respecting you the second they smell weakness. That sounded exactly like my father. Mason kept talking after that. Words coming faster now like once he started. He couldn't stop anymore. Then he started moving money around. Loans, credit lines, temporary fixes. He looked at me carefully. You always had the best credit. Stable job, stable income. Dad said using your name was protecting the family because nobody would loan to him anymore. I stared at him in disbelief. And you just helped him? His face twisted slightly. You don't get it. Dad doesn't really ask people things. He makes survival feel like obedience. That sentence hit me harder than I expected because it was the first honest thing my brother had ever said to me. What about the gambling? He looked ashamed then for the first time in his life. It got worse after the business debt started stacking up. I kept thinking one good hit could fix everything. Instead, you buried us deeper. Yeah. Silence settled between us after that. Heavy. Exhausted. Then quietly Mason asked, Do you hate me? I thought about that carefully before answering. No, I said finally. I think you spent your whole life learning Dad would always save you. And I spent my whole life learning he never would. Mason looked away immediately after that because deep down, I think he knew it was true too. 3 days later, investigators formally froze the remaining active trust accounts. That was the real end. Not legally maybe, not technically, but psychologically, because my father's entire identity depended on maintaining control through resources. The moment access disappeared, everything else started collapsing around him rapidly. The house he and my mother lived in entered emergency review due to hidden debt exposure. 2 vehicles were flagged under disputed financing records. Outstanding supplier claims resurfaced. Old contractors started cooperating with investigators once they realized the situation had become serious enough that silence no longer protected anyone. And suddenly people who'd spent years fearing my father stopped fearing him. That part changed everything. One former employee contacted Victor with copies of altered invoices from almost a decade earlier. Another contractor admitted my father routinely shifted payment responsibilities across shell accounts whenever pressure increased. Then a retired accountant came forward privately claiming he'd warned my father years ago that trust misuse involving family members could eventually become criminal. The pattern kept widening. Meanwhile, my mother unraveled completely. She began leaving voicemails daily, sometimes crying, sometimes angry, sometimes sounding so emotionally exhausted I barely recognized her voice anymore. You're destroying your father. No, The truth was simply reaching him faster than before. The worst voicemail came late one night while Sophie slept upstairs. "You could stop this if you wanted to," my mother whispered through tears. "Families survive things like this all the time if people stay loyal." That sentence haunted me afterward because it perfectly summarized the sickness underneath my entire upbringing. Loyalty mattered more than honesty, more than safety, more than ethics. The appearance of family mattered more than whether the family itself functioned healthily. I stopped listening to the voicemails after that. Then, in early December, something happened I never expected. My father asked to meet alone. Victor strongly advised against it. Claire practically begged me not to go. But some part of me needed to see him one final time outside lawyers and paperwork and investigations. Maybe closure. Maybe curiosity. Maybe I just wanted to understand whether he felt anything real underneath all the manipulation. We met at an old diner outside town near the highway where truckers stopped during overnight routes. Neutral territory. Mostly empty. My father looked smaller somehow sitting alone in that booth when I walked in. Not physically smaller. Human smaller. Like the myth around him had finally burned away. For almost a minute neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "You look tired." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "You forged my name across half my adult life. You think I wanted this? That's not an answer." He stared out the diner window briefly while headlights moved across the parking lot outside. "When your mother got sick," he said slowly, "everything started slipping. Money, reputation, business." He rubbed one hand over his face. "People disappear when they think you're drowning. So you used me." I leaned on family. "No," I replied calmly. "You built your survival on me." He flinched slightly hearing that. Then, for the first time in my entire life, my father looked genuinely old. "You were always dependable," he said quietly. "I trusted you to hold things together." I stared at him across that table for a very long time because suddenly I understood something devastating. My father truly believed exploitation became love if he convinced himself it served the family. "You know what the worst part is?" I asked. He looked up slowly. "I would have helped you." Silence. "If you had just told me the truth years ago, I would have helped." His eyes shifted downward after that because deep down, I think he knew that too. But honesty would have required vulnerability. And men like my father would rather destroy people than appear weak. "I never meant for Sophie to get dragged into this," he muttered eventually. Something inside me hardened immediately hearing her name. "You already did." He looked exhausted suddenly. "What happens now?" I leaned back slowly. "I don't know." That was the truth. By then, the process had moved beyond me emotionally. Investigators handled the evidence. Attorneys handled the legal structure. Banks handled the financial exposure. I wasn't orchestrating revenge anymore. I was just no longer stopping consequences from reaching him. My father nodded faintly after that. Then quietly he said, "You remind me of him." "Who?" "My father." The diner suddenly felt very still around us. "You said he abandoned you." "He did." My father swallowed once. "But before he left, he stopped being afraid of his own family." I stared at him carefully because suddenly I realized generational damage doesn't just repeat behavior. It repeats fear. My father spent his whole life terrified of becoming weak. Abandoned. Powerless like the man before him. In trying to outrun that fear, he became someone else entirely. "You could have broken this too," I said softly. He looked away. I didn't know how. That was the closest thing to honesty I ever got from him. We never hugged. Never reconciled. Never had some cinematic emotional breakthrough. Real life rarely works like that. Sometimes closure is simply seeing somebody clearly enough that they stop controlling the story inside your head. When I left the diner that night, my father stayed sitting in the booth alone staring into untouched coffee while winter rain slid down the windows behind him. That was the last time I saw him in person. The legal resolution took another 4 months. Eventually, the trust structure collapsed completely under review. Multiple forged authorizations were formally invalidated. The eviction filing against me was withdrawn permanently. Ownership rights connected to my house were restored directly into my name through court correction orders. Several debt obligations tied solely to fraudulent leverage practices were separated from my liability after forensic review confirmed signature inconsistencies. My father avoided prison through negotiated settlements, asset liquidation, age considerations, and partial cooperation once evidence became overwhelming. But financially, socially, emotionally, his life never recovered. My parents sold their house quietly in spring. No goodbye gathering, no dramatic ending, just a moving truck one cloudy Tuesday morning. Mason entered rehab not long afterward. Last I heard, he was working construction 2 counties over trying to rebuild his life slowly. We speak occasionally now, carefully, like people learning a new language neither fully trusts yet. My mother sent one final letter 6 months after everything ended. No excuses this time, just one sentence written near the bottom that stayed with me longer than the rest. I think we confused surviving with loving for too long. I never replied, not because I hated her, because some relationships end long before contact stops. About a year after the eviction notice, Sophie and I repainted the kitchen together during spring break. Music playing too loud, paint on our clothes, her laughing every time I accidentally stepped in roller trays like an idiot. At one point she stopped painting and looked around the house quietly. Then she asked, "Nobody can take this from us now, right?" I set the brush down slowly after hearing that because suddenly I realized children measure safety differently than adults do. Not through legal documents or mortgage statements, through consistency, through whether the adults around them feel stable. "No," I told her gently, "not anymore." She smiled after that and went back to painting like the question itself weighed nothing. But I stood there watching her for a long moment because deep down I understood something I hadn't at the beginning of all this. The house was never the real thing I was fighting for. It was her, her future, her understanding of love, her belief that family should feel safe instead of transactional, that truth mattered more than comfort, that boundaries weren't cruelty, that protecting yourself from people who hurt you wasn't betrayal. Sometimes breaking a cycle doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it looks like paperwork, like silence, like refusing to answer another manipulative voicemail, like an 11-year-old girl finally feeling safe inside her own home again. My father lost control of my finances, lost his reputation, lost the illusion he spent decades building around himself. But the thing he lost that mattered most was access. Access to my guilt, access to my obedience, access to the version of me that believed love meant enduring anything quietly. And what I gained in return wasn't revenge. It was peace. For the first time in my life, I stopped surviving my family and started protecting my own.